I'd like to welcome all of you to UNM, even if virtually, and to today's book talk and panel with UNM author and faculty member Dr. Jennifer Tucker. This talk is hosted by UNM's Latin American and Iberian Institute, so I want to thank them for creating this venue for us today. My name is Sam Truitt. I direct something called the Center for the Southwest, which is a small center here in the Department of History at UNM, where we do historical and cross-disciplinary work and events on things like borderland studies, Native American and Indigenous studies, environmental and social justice studies, and related fields like that. And as someone whose personal work is in borderlands history, broadly construed, it's a real pleasure to introduce you today to my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Tucker, whose work in the urban borderlands of Latin America you'll be learning about today. Dr. Tucker is an associate professor of community and regional planning here at the University of New Mexico, with research expertise on urban inequality, social justice struggles, and frontiers of racial capitalism in the Americas. Her work on the urban interfaces of Paraguay and Brazil offer local insights into infrastructures of extra-legality and commodity flows, the grassroots production of economic and social space, and dynamics of social justice and social transformation. These are local relationships that ramify far beyond the borderlands, helping us think in new ways about popular logics, spatial anchors, and insurgent circulations of local and global contraband networks. Today, she will carry us into the heart of these globalized local economies, the so-called black markets and gray spaces of Ciudad del Este, the underpinnings of what she calls outlaw capital. Her book, Outlaw Capital, Everyday Illegalities in the Making of Uneven Development, which came out last year, is the subject of our conversation today. We're also quite fortunate to have two others with us here today, scholars who will discuss Tucker's new book with her. I would like to welcome Dr. Malini Raghunathan, Associate Professor in the School of International Service at American University. Dr. Raghunathan is a scholar of urban environmental justice, interested in the political economy of land, labor, and ecology in the capitalist city. I would also like to welcome Dr. Teo Bhalwe, Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and Geography at Colgate University. Dr. Bhalwe's work focuses on the drug trade, rural development, and right-wing politics in the Americas. And let me offer a real quick roadmap of our event today. Dr. Tucker will speak first for about 30 minutes. Doctors Raghunathan and Bhalwe will then speak next for about 10 minutes each. And then Dr. Tucker will give a brief response, after which we'll open things up to the audience, finishing things up at around 4:45 our time, Mountain Standard Time. And with that, I'll hand things over now to Dr. Jennifer Tucker.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam, for the introduction, and to the LAII for hosting this talk. Daniela, it looks like there's a few people in the waiting room, so if you could let them in, that would be great. And I'm particularly excited to be in conversation with two researchers that I greatly admire, Malini Raghunathan and Teo Bhalwe, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really an honor. My research centers on economic justice and unequal cities. My book argues that outlaw economies and the spaces they produce are integral to global capitalism. Further, I show how racialized narratives of economic legitimacy across scales hide the centrality of the transgressive in global capitalism. I ground this analysis in what one journalist has called the largest illicit economy on the continent, in the tri-border region of South America, where Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina meet. Ciudad del Este, Paraguay is the heart of the border trade, where traders import and then re-export commodities worth several billions of dollars each year, connecting Chinese export processing factories with consumers across South America. Here, thousands of Paraguayan vendors and small-scale Brazilian traders called sacoleros mix with businessmen from places like Lebanon and Seoul. Together, they move an astounding volume of consumer goods, everything from cell phones to whiskey, providing cheap transit to Asian manufacturers and invisible subsidies to Brazilian consumers. Over a fast 50 years, the city transformed from a tiny frontier outpost into a global trading hub, as central to globalization as New York or London. While central, the city is stigmatized as lawless. This graphic novel, for instance, narrates the city as a den of criminality, while the US Trade Representative named Ciudad del Este as a notorious market listed for selling counterfeit goods like CDs or cell phones, which they argue produce significant economic harms to US interests. While the border economy is condemned, it's also crucial. Tens of thousands of poor street vendors and traders depend on the border economy. Ciudad del Este exemplifies globalization from below because ordinary workers, not just transnational corporations, benefit from global trade. While outlaw economies are central to global capitalism, their spatial productions and politics are not well understood. Disciplines like geography, planning, and urban studies, equipped to analyze the social production of space, remain, quote, almost entirely undisturbed by research in anthropology, criminology, and sociology, detailing the power and reach of extralegal economies. My research intervenes here, showing how globalized capitalism depends on cities like Ciudad del Este, while this transgressive trade economy produces its own kind of space. The stakes of these research exceed these South American borderlands. From Mexico's narco state to regime toppling corruption scandals in Brazil, the profits from outlaw economies, what I call outlaw capital, cement alliances between government officials and shady alliances and networks. In many places, outlaw capital undermines democratic practice. Today, I'll present just a slice of my recent book, focusing on the making of Ciudad del Este as a gray space of transgressive profitability, and the racialized narratives that obscure both the city's material centrality and the extent of elite illegalities. Before I get into the empirical story, I'll start with a few words about my concept of outlaw capital. Outlaw capital is a mode of accumulation that works through deal making and rule breaking. Conceptually, it is a form of capital that negotiates profits and distributes rents through deals, bribes, and schemes. Of course, appropriation and dispossession have always been core to the logics of capital. Capitalism continually renews its conditions of possibility by capturing or colonizing hitherto uncommodified spheres of life, from stealing indigenous land to commodifying clean air through carbon markets. These enclosures are an ongoing process rather than a founding moment. Unlike what Marx calls the silent compulsion of wage exploitation, to which many of us consent, these enclosures often involve violence and coercion. According to David Harvey, these processes of accumulation by dispossession, rather than value creation, are the, quote, dominant form of accumulation under late capitalism, a seismic reframing of Marxism's historic focus on production and labor narrowly defined. Rather than enclosing an easily identifiable commons, what I call accumulation by transgression captures or redistributes revenue streams through illegalities. Of course, capitalists often break the law, but with outlaw capital, transgression creates the conditions of possibility. Contraband economies and outlaw capital are ghostly. They operate in the shadows and draw power from being hard to see. They do not exist on official maps and escape national customs accounts of imports and exports. Indeed, because transgression is inherent in outlaw capital, its advocates must seek way to hide and obscure it. Practices that also, quote, remove the blockage of illegality, as Theo Balve has shown in relation to narco capital. I suggest that racial and spatial strategies are also at work here. Outlaw economies also challenge many mental maps of what economies are supposed to look like. The abstract models employed by economists and development experts wildly misread the everyday messiness of economic life in places like Ciudad del Este. These models miss how outlaw capital works through racialized norms of protection, prosecution, and immunity that tend to protect the well-off and expose the already vulnerable. Often these elite illegalities are talked about as corruption, a framework imagining separate public and private spheres, as well as political and economic ones, which we inherit from Eurocentric state theory. This misinformed mapping is mapped by an anti-corruption industry reliant on the disciplinary assumptions of economics and, as Janine Waddell has shown, ignoring other social science research. Joshi and Ranganathan argued that these theories of corruption overlook the legalized forms of taking, dispossession, and exploitation at capitalism's core. Their predictive, imaginative geography locates corruption in the global south, whitewashing the extensive role of corporate power, private interests, and dark money in the global north. Their individualistic remedies seek to punish bad actors rather than rework systems. Instead of separate spheres, thinking with Outlaw Capital helps focus attention on the everyday profiteering practices while encouraging more rigorous ways of analyzing the relationship between the political and the economic. On a flight to Asuncion in 2015, I sat next to a white woman from Ohio, a naturalized Paraguayan married to a successful businessman. We chatted about Elisa's comfortable upper-class life and her childhood in Paraguay as a diplomat's daughter under Alfredo Stroessner, a brutal dictator who ruled Paraguay between 1954 and 1989. When I shared my research in Ciudad del Este, a frown flashed across her face and her chattiness faded fast. Her husband leaned into the conversation, commenting that the city ran on contraband and pirated CDs. Elisa concluded, quote, "I always tell people that Ciudad del Este isn't Paraguay," emphasizing the isn't and abruptly shifting the conversation. Elisa saw the city as a problem place, seeking to excise Ciudad del Este from the nation, constructing it as somehow outside of real Paraguay. Her husband's comment suggests that anxieties about extralegality motivate this desire to set Ciudad del Este apart. Over empanadas, I shared Elisa's comments with Sofia Espindola, a researcher and friend. Espindola recounted growing up in another frontier boomtown, which, like Ciudad del Este, drew rural migrants expelled from the countryside by industrial agriculture. But with few wage jobs, the survival of many depended on the border economy. Espindola argued Elisa's imaginative exclusion of the frontier from the nation represented a common, situated discourse, a view from the capital city, that delighted in scandalous stories of drug running and contraband through frontier cities, but which sought distance from its object of ridicule. These stigmatizing narratives, as she called them, confine illicit trade to border cities and then sever these spaces from a socially constructed understanding of real Paraguay. They also deny the struggles of residents for whom smuggling is the only buffer against destitution. I came to think of these narratives as spatial imaginaries with important political lives. Like what Louis Quaquant calls territorial stigmatization, denigrating ghettos and slums, Elisa's narrative spatializes a so-called cultural dysfunction, in this case corruption and illegalities, discursively combining them to particular spaces imagined as underdeveloped or backward, and then cutting them out of our theories of global capitalist change. These stigmatizing narratives influence academic research. For instance, the Go To Paraguay Reader condenses the rise of Ciudad del Este as a multi-billion-dollar trading hub into a 4-page hyperbolic Financial Times article. In this narrative, the cities of hustlers was hacked out of the jungle where, subsequently, a culture of graft thwarts various formalization efforts. Stories like this depict the autonomous rise of a deviant city, misdiagnosing transgression as a cultural failing or state incapacity rather than as a local expression of globalized capital. In the book, I show how the views of elites in the capital city, the Brazilian media, and US free trade advocates are distinct and yet converge in the identification of local sources of lawlessness. Both regional and neo-colonial spatial imaginaries construct rule breaking as a trait of Paraguayan culture by drawing from racialized stereotypes, ignoring the ways the city and the border trade are produced relationally across extensive geographies of commerce and globalized capitalism. Disavowing these material realities requires a blindness to the many points of interconnection along this key global trade route. These discursive dismissals are both spatial and racial, and they contribute to outlaw capital's power. While Ciudad del Este is cast outside of most stories of global capitalist change, it is in fact central, providing cheap transit to goods produced in signature spaces of globalization like Chinese special economic zones. These transit networks also subsidize consumption across South America. But far from a lawless zone outside state control, state projects built the city as a trading hub, where legal trade and smuggling mix. Traders profit through arbitrage, that is, taking advantage of price differences between different markets. Proximity to Brazil is a sort of spatially fixed asset. During the 1960s, Brazil protected nascent national industry with high tariffs and imported goods through import substitution industrialization. Inadvertently, Brazil's high tariffs created lucrative arbitrage possibilities. Traders imported goods to Paraguay under relatively low tariffs, smuggled or transported them into Brazil, where they resold the goods at a higher price. In these dynamics, the legal and the extra-legal intertwine. Following guidance from the International Monetary Fund in 1956, the Paraguayan state cut taxes and tariffs to promote the legal re-exportations of goods through Paraguay. Since the 1990s, registered re-exportation moved goods worth between 1 and 5 billion US dollars annually. Yet legal re-exportation mixes with extra-legal trade. Alfredo Stroessner inaugurated Paraguay's tradition of state-sanctioned smuggling, even calling it the price of peace, because he gained allies by allocating contraband routes to potential rivals. Contrabandistas smuggled luxury goods like perfume, whiskey, and cigarettes, helping middle-class Brazilians perform their class status. Stroessner's fall threw into question centralized control of contraband. As a growth coalition I call the Merchant Bloc fought for control over the border trade. Today, too, the state sometimes backs extra-legal trade. Custom agents systematically ignore the official tariff classification process, instead clearing cargo planes of high-value merchandise by weight and pocketing the money they divert from state coffers, a practice called undervaluation. These deal-making networks protect their profits. An ex-finance minister explained how customs agents resisted reform by reducing tax revenue to the national treasury, wryly observing, quote, immediately when there is an effort to reform customs personnel, revenue collections fall. Hey, Daniela, can you let Raul in from the waiting room? The Merchant Bloc also fought to decouple the municipal government from national oversight, even creating a shadow institution to evade constitutionally required audits of Ciudad del Este's municipal accounts. In 2003, a powerful mayor convinced a judge to forbid the national comptroller from evaluating the municipality's books, instead establishing a parallel governmental body, the Tribunal de Cuentas. The Tribunal de Cuentas evaluated municipal accounts in closed-door proceedings, only publishing a one-page summary of their findings that either approved or rejected the municipal filing. This shadow institution enabled a kind of plausible deniability, especially useful as transparency activists brought multiple legal and legislative challenges, charging municipal corruption. Indeed, the state backed re-exportation and contraband as a strategy of development, even as some sectors opposed the border trade. When changing conditions threatened the trade economy, state policies continued to back re-exportation. For instance, extracting concessions to protect arbitrage in international negotiations with the regional customs union Mercosur, which sought to liberalize trade within the bloc. State infrastructure projects also support the border trade. After the city's founding in 1954, traders relied on small planes and private landing strips, transporting luxury goods like whiskey from Miami. In the 1960s, Highway 2 and the International Friendship Bridge transformed the material basis of the border trade, and soon the bridge became the central trade artery. These transport infrastructures unexpectedly democratized access to smuggling. After 9/11, border security took on new regional importance, which drove another round of transformation. Brazil, backed by the US, criminalized the popular trade circuit and tightened its borders. In response, traders turned to the river, clearing patches of riverbank for makeshift landing zones. These clandestine ports are a key space of trade. Hundreds of unauthorized ports dot both sides of the Paraná River and the upstream Itaipu Lake on the Paraguayan and Brazilian side. Defying expectations of what globalized spaces look like, these unassuming patches of riverbank process millions of dollars worth of inventory without cranes or container ships. Former President Cartes relies on clandestine ports to transport cigarettes produced in his frontier factories. His factories produce 20 billion cigarettes yearly, 2% of which are smoked by Paraguayans. Networks running through clandestine ports help flood regional markets with his contraband cigarettes. Massive tax evasion reduces the costs of Cartes' cigarettes such that rule breaking is the source of his profit. That is outlaw capital. Cartes disavows connections to contraband by hiding behind a complex division of labor that concentrates risks onto specialized traffickers called cigarreros, the ones of the cigarettes. He says, quote, contraband is a customs problem. We do not do any contraband. We have a totally clean conscience. The brazenness of Cartes' transgression alongside his claim to a clean conscience suggests a deep-seated sense of entitlement to profit outside the law. The merchant bloc also makes good use of the mall as they promote urban development for the border trade in both its legal and extra-legal moments. In the mid-2000s, the merchant bloc began investing in mall development along the Paraná riverfront. First, with the controversial construction in 2006 of Shopping del Este on a contested land parcel promised to street vendors. Then 2 more malls quickly sprung up. While Shopping del Este looks legal, developers broke multiple rules, laws, and codes to build malls on the 9 hectares, a story I won't have time to tell today. Even further, clandestine ports move some of the goods purchased in malls like Shopping del Este. Rumors described full-service transportation logistics for Brazilian buyers, in which businesses arranged for taxi drivers to transport merchandise to clandestine ports, traffickers to ferry it across the river, and Brazilian workers to deliver packages the next morning to hotel rooms in Foz do Iguaçu. A powerful spatial imaginary distinguishes these malls from clandestine ports and vendor stalls, affiliating malls with progress while situating stalls and clandestine ports as problems. Yet these forms are intertwined. Even further, the spatial form of the mall conceals the very social processes of extralegality that create and sustain it. Undervaluation and state-supported smuggling are examples of accumulation by transgression. That is, deal-making practices that capture value. Such high-end profiteering practices are enabled by the systemic imbrication of public and private actors and of state and economic capacities. Instead of separate spheres, thinking with outlaw capital helps focus attention on specific profiteering practices and points us to more rigorous ways of thinking about the relationship between the political and the economic. One model of this thinking is what Joshua Barkan, his argument that corporate economic and state power are, quote, ontologically linked, doubled, conjoined, but also in conflict. Instead of corruption, I argue outlaw capital better assesses the folding together of political and economic powers in accumulation by transgression. The transgression inherent to outlaw capital's profitability means that its advocates must seek ways to hide and obscure it. I suggest that spatial and racial strategies are at work here. The spatial aesthetics of the mall acts as an alibi. Shopping malls index widely held aspirations to participate in global modernity through consumption. By signifying globalized modernity, the mall can stand in for legality and formalization. Indeed, across Latin America, planners have come to imagine the mall as, quote, an effective solution to the problem of informality, as Arlene Davila shows, because they mobilize the look of legality. Thus, malls are talismans and fetishes invested with powers to promote economic development, provide jobs, offer privatized community space, and push cities in the global south towards a Eurocentric modernity. While malls are materially connected to smuggling circuits, their symbolic resonances successfully masked these interconnections. In Ciudad del Este, the merchant bloc uses the mall to make an aesthetic claim to legality and formality. In addition to this aesthetic alibi, I show in the book that the promise of the mall also rests on how it displaces the street livelihoods of the poor. Other spatial strategies also hide outlaw capital. Residents use the term blindaje to describe arrangements between judges and politicians, promising impunity for kickbacks. Blindaje is a military term for a protective screen. Its double sense connotes both protection and an impediment to visibility. Blindaje helps explain the practices of power that protect the ports from oversight. For instance, between 2013 and 2018, state agencies carried out zero enforcement operations in the port zone, protecting the smuggling networks that moved cartes, cigarettes, and other goods. These political pacts for protection outlived Cartes's presidential term, surviving even contentious power struggles in the long dominant Colorado Party. Blindaje also zones clandestine ports as off limits to certain kinds of publics, including journalists and foreign researchers. Chatting with a taxi driver about a riverfront neighborhood hosting the ports, he commented casually to me, "Oh, you can't go there." He emphasized the you, suggesting that the spatial restriction was not universal, but rather connected to me and, I suspect, my embodied outsiderness. This small act of blindaje helped produce a conditional map of no-go zones. Likewise, a journalist recounted covering an enforcement operation at the port. As his car wound down the dirt road, residents gathered to block the path, brandishing sticks and yelling, "Leave us poor people alone." This small uprising defended the popular extralegal economy, yet these port workers and contraband runners are also enrolled in blindaje, protecting the spaces of smuggling that generate fortunes for rich men. Thus, blindaje is a spatial practice. Racialized perceptions of legitimacy also hide outlaw capital. Paraguayans use the term blancamiento, or whitening, to speak of political moves to whitewash the crimes of the powerful. Cartes, for instance, served jail time for currency fraud, but then had his record expunged by the Supreme Court. Indeed, Cartes's rap sheet is long, including contraband, currency fraud, and money laundering. However, the social standing of men like Cartes buttress their claims to legitimacy. They occupy positions of power, and Cartes has even been favorably assessed in media outlets like Forbes and The Economist. Successful performances of legitimacy are unsurprisingly worked out through social hierarchies of race, class, and gender. Blancamiento thus names how wealth and whiteness serve to enact impunity and hide connections to outlaw capital. It also identifies a kind of blindness where we look away from the transgressions of outlaw capitalists or interpret them as legitimate, precisely because the bodies of these men index the common sense category of the successful businessman. Extending this local critique of blancamiento helps analyze elite illegalities in the context of racial capitalism. Rationalities of what Eileen Morton Robinson calls the white possessive naturalize settler possession of indigenous land while exonerating the innumerable ethical and legal transgressions that enable ownership. In settler societies, indigenous dispossession is foundational. It is the condition of possibility for the nation state, shaping both forms of property and personhood. The white possessive includes a sense of entitlement to take, to own, to exclude, and to dispossess. Whiteness is thus an unself-conscious taking rendered as the natural order of things. In his analysis of US institutional racism, George Lipsitz describes whiteness as, quote, a racial cartel that hoards resources while masquerading behind mythologies of personal responsibility, meritocracy, and legal doctrines of colorblindness. Extending blancamiento then emphasizes whiteness as a racial cartel protecting transgressive forms of property. This points to a certain doubleness. Whiteness shapes the landscape of legality and the train of rights in the political economic interests of the dominant group, a time-honored tradition of class power. Yet at the same time, whiteness also secures protection for ill-gotten wealth and legal trespass. Outlaw capital is one form of entitled taking. Blancamiento is how outlaw capitalists enact legitimacy for their transgressive forms of possession. Forms of property, of course, differ historically, and I'm not suggesting that outlaw capital reproduces the terrible logic of mass indigenous dispossession. I am suggesting that extending blancamiento through the lens of the white possessive focuses our attention on how elites naturalize their transgressive forms of possession. In conclusion, I offer outlaw capital as a concrete concept through which to analyze extralegal economies. Outlaw capital is a mode of accumulation that works through deal making and rule breaking. Uninvested in producing surplus value, it is a form of capital that negotiates profits and distributes rents through situated forms of deals, bribes, and schemes. By staking a claim to the category of capital, I contend outlaw capital is central, not an exotic aberration or a stage of underdevelopment to be overcome through the expansion of real capitalism. This is not to suggest a new binary, differentiating transgressive from clean capital, but rather to emphasize the transformations of capital through different forms as it circulates through different moments in economic circuits. I also argue that outlaw capital is a mode of spatial production. Malls, signature spaces of the so-called formal city and spaces symbolizing modernity can be enrolled in outlaw economies. Just as frontier malls depend on clandestine ports, signature spaces of globalization like special economic zones use zones of transgression like Ciudad del Este. Stigmatizing narratives split these places apart, misreading global interconnection as local forms of lawlessness, abetted by racialized narratives of Paraguayan alterity and corruption. These discourses of disconnection have material impacts, contributing to our misreading of outlaw capital's power. Furthermore, racism helps hide outlaw capital. Blancamiento names the political pacts for protection that confer impunity on elites based on class position and proximity to whiteness. It offers a subversive perspective on elite illegalities, naming them as the norm and as constitutive of state power. Yet the Blancamiento critique often identifies elite illegalities as individual moral failings rather than the social relations of racial capitalism, in which whiteness as property includes forms of accumulation by transgression. Extending Blancamiento then emphasizes whiteness as a racial cartel, protecting transgressive forms of property. It matters that we make theory from places like Ciudad del Este. From here, we can construct a more complete story of global capitalist change, including the historical processes that have made Ciudad del Este a zone of transgression. Global capitalism produces similar places and border zones around the world. Indeed, Ciudad del Este is not an exceptional space, but rather an expression of accumulation by transgression's role in contemporary capitalism. Illegalities also shape spaces widely interpreted as clean, from banks in Bern, Switzerland, hiding ill-gotten wealth, to Russian oligarchs investing in property in Londongrad. Concentrating outlaw capital in particular spaces does not mean its effects do not reverberate throughout the system. As the Panama and Pandora Papers demonstrate, the vaunted worlds of finance are interwoven with outlaw capital. Theorizing with outlaw capital underscores that liberal bureaucratic capitalism is one form among many, and perhaps an exceptional waning one. Critical planning scholars go beyond interpreting the world, seeking instead to change it. Theory is useful when it helps bridge the gap between today and a more just tomorrow. I suggest that contesting the racialized politics of outlaw capital is a key challenge for those of us committed to more just futures. Concrete concepts adequate to the complexity of our conjuncture are a necessary, even if insufficient, precondition for liberatory change. Transformation requires collective action. I hope that ideas from my recent book will be useful to diverse projects aims towards enacting geographies of justice. Thank you so much for your kind attention. And Malini, will pass the mic on to you.
Thank you so much to Jennifer Tucker for inviting me to this great panel. It's so nice to be here with you and UNM colleagues. Wonderful also to be here with Teo, whose work I also greatly admire. It's just terrific to see your book and all the arguments come together. I marked so many pages of it, Jen, because I enjoyed reading it so much. I really want to start by commending you on how beautifully written, theorized, argued, and empirically substantiated this book is. There were moments, many moments in the book where I read a sentence and I was like, wow, that sentence is just so well crafted, you know? I wanted to read two of them for you all because it just shows the power of Jen's writing. And this is from the conclusion. She says, and I quote, Thus, at every scale, extra-legal networks are integral, not anathema, to so-called formal systems of power and profit. At every scale, extra-legal networks are integral, not anathema, to so-called formal systems of power and profit, right? That's just, I think that's such a good summation of her argument that you just heard laid out. That's on page 169, the conclusion. Another super well-crafted, like just mind-blowingly, well done sentence is on page 120 on the chapter that I also really liked on street vendors and their political agency. And she says, and I quote, "This is about excavating already existing counter-hegemonic practices of everyday life to uncover and amplify the embers of different ways of thinking, being, and becoming, modes that move towards liberation, justice, and a redistribution of social resources," end quote. And that is her project here, right? Is to expose the ways in which these sort of mythologies of global capitalism obscure the actually existing nefarious, illicit, extra-legal, outlaw drivers of capital, right? While at the same time criminalizing those, who are trying to eke a living, right, through these outlaw processes, but who are also trying to call out, right, the double standard of the state in Ciudad del Este. So, apart from the superb writing on display here, I also would like to point out that this is a model of ethical, self-reflexive, truth-telling, and decolonial scholarship. There's several points in the story where she puts herself in the story in a very, very sensitive way. So it's not just a sort of positionality statement at the beginning or end, but a kind of constant reflection on her own, right? Complicity in many ways and ability to sort of cross borders with ease, and many times maybe obscuring some of the more illicit processes that are at play, while kind of really only fixing our attention on crime as the sort of hegemonic actors define it. And so I think it really sort of behooves a questioning of all of our roles, right, in outlaw capital in many ways, and what is revealed and what is hidden. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is really talk about why this book is so timely and relevant beyond Ciudad del Este, right? She says at many points that, this is a small town that no one really ever thinks about, right? I mean, even or especially the elite lady she sat next to the plane is like, oh, that's an armpit, it's super crime, it's a crime den, etc. But like, what does it mean to actually think with her findings to a much broader global context? So I'd like to start with that. Then I'll talk briefly about why the book spoke so much to my own heart, to my own work at the intersection of critical urban studies, critical corruption studies. And finally, I just want to throw some questions out there for her, on the table for her to answer, maybe for all of you to think about as well as you read this book, so we can have a little bit of a discussion before we close. So in terms of why this book is so timely and relevant beyond this local context, I really want to bring out this term of blancamiento, and also the twin concept she uses of obscuration. So I think we're witnessing, so technically the term translates, I guess, loosely in English to whitening, right? And she, of course, then draws out critical race theory and its contributions to understanding the work of whiteness and whitening. But it has also a very interesting colloquial resonance here that I think is helpful beyond what critical race theory gives us, right? I think we're in an era right now in which the legitimacy of the West and its liberal mantras of peace and order, democracy and human rights, freedom and the rule of law, that legitimacy has never been weaker. At least in my lifetime, the legitimacy of the West, as seen by a wide swath of the world, right, in the global South, but also elsewhere, has never been so questioned. And of course, that also comes with a questioning of the legitimacy and unassailability of certain Western hegemonic ideas. And so this is where I think Jennifer's book really provides a monumental contribution to the destabilization of liberal capitalist common sense. And in many ways, a sort of whitening that happens in so many different ways, right? around these common sense notions. She problematizes not only common sense about the separation between legality and illegality, clean and dirty, entrepreneur and criminal, but also the common sense about certain people and places being marked as innately deviant and criminal. Ciudad del Este is one such place that is marked as a kind of contraband capital with contraband people. I mean, that's essentially what's going on with the racialization of the indigenous groups and the poorer groups that are street vending is, right? They're not just selling contraband, but they themselves are out of place, right? And so this is a place that is said to be one where lawlessness, bribery, illicit trade, and everything from cigarettes to electronics to cheap leather handbags and fake leather jackets is said to run rampant. So I really appreciated that she brought out this vernacular term, blancamiento, which is a term used by those so-called contraband people to say, you know, as you call us and see us as contraband or see us as out of place, right? You whiten and you erase, you launder, which is another great term, right? Your own illicit activities, your own immorality. And I think just taking that particular concept, applying it beyond Ciudad del Este is very, very helpful, because this process of blancamiento and concomitantly obscuration, which is a terminology she indicates how to say how authorizing epistemology, so hegemonic knowledge, right? Say notions that I just mentioned earlier, peace and order, or democracy and human rights, et cetera, but even capitalist notions of bootstraps, merit, hard work, stages of development, right? The dogma of development economics, all of these do the work of hiding the actual existing processes of looting and exploitation that churn the accumulation of value. So Jen really it gives us a story about what exactly greases the wheels of transnational capitalism and what exactly is willfully obscured from view in the process. Again, a story that is true well beyond Paraguay, well beyond Ciudad del Este. I think one thing that was sort of between the text also, as far as this term blanqueamiento and what the and obscuration does, is it also sort of fixes on the present, right? It's a spatially and truncated viewpoint. So when you see certain people as contraband, right, or you see certain the activities as outlaw, you don't actually connect it with the sort of veins of transnational capital, right? The trade routes stretching from China through this very busy corridor onto Argentina and Brazil. You kind of just fixate on a particular space and say that place is bad, right? But everything else is sort of blurred in. And it's also a temporally truncated viewpoint because you're not looking at the histories that led to this particular point in time, right? So it's very convenient, this blanqueamiento and this obscuration, because it's very fixed spatially and very fixed temporally. So I think this framework is very relevant to what we see today, right? In terms of how certain places are fixed and blacklisted as terrorist, for instance, right? While others are painted in more moralistic tones. I think it's very relevant for understanding the U.S. border crisis, right? It's fixated on that particular area, and poor migrants who are often seen as criminal from the get-go coming in from Central and South America. But there's very little discussion of the much more translocal root causes of the border crisis, right? The U.S.'s own complicity in transnational gang networks or impoverishment or drug economies. So it's a very strategic move rhetorically to fixate on the present or fixate on a particular region and obscure everything else out of view. In terms of how this work, I think, speaks so much to my own work on the politics of land dispossession in urban spaces, especially in India, and the deployment of anti-corruption narratives, right, both in progressive and at times regressive ways. Jen really helpfully lays out 3 different registers of anti-corruption talk, all of which I think circulate in the world today and are really helpful for all of us who hear corruption being used a lot, but also are a bit wary of its overuse or its opportunistic use, right? So the one that we hear a lot, we've been hearing for decades, ever since the neoliberal turn, is really this market liberal hegemonic anti-corruption discourse pushed by Transparency International and the World Bank, which predictably paints states in the global south, again, fixating just on a locale, not looking at the historical roots in colonialism and transnational corruption, right? But focuses on the global south as highly corrupt and the global north largely is very clean. So that's the sort of one view. It very much is a market-led viewpoint because it locates all evil like on the state and really very much less so on market actors and corporate actors. The second is more of an anti-corruption narrative from below. It's this use of terms like blancamiento, right? It's flipping the script. Jason Hickel has this wonderful term of flipping the script where the sort of the transgressions of the wealthy become more under the spotlight than previously. And we see that this is something I've been writing about with colleagues, and more recently in my co-authored book, where slum dwellers who've been evicted for being illegal, you flip the corruption script and say, well, look at those malls, et cetera, that are far more in contravention of zoning laws, ecological laws, et cetera. So I think that is a kind of anti-corruption from below. The third, though, that I think is really interesting and disturbing is the way in which anti-corruption sits all too comfortably with nativist, xenophobic, racist, right-wing nationalist politics. And she gets to this a lot in the conclusion. And I wanted to hear, I mean, this is where I'll start my questions and then wrap up. What's the future horizon of this third regressive version of anti-corruption politics? How does it gather steam? How does it gather steam in Paraguay? And how does it gather steam throughout the rest of Latin America? What makes it work? What makes it tractionable as a language for the right to gain populist support, by suturing anti-corruption to racist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic talk as well, nationalist, right? Who belongs and who doesn't belong in the nation. So that's the first question I had. The second question I had is that in the Indian urban studies literature, there's this term jugaad, which literally means sort of street smart entrepreneurship. It translates, the loose translation is improvised or improvisation, but it's very difficult to translate. It refers to how people retrofit like a motorbike into an auto rickshaw and make it run, and people also are wheeler dealing and they engage in this sort of transgressive, illicit street activity. It's very romanticized, right? That's what's really interesting. So the neoliberals have taken jugaad, which is like a mechanism of street survival, right, including vending and that kind of stuff, and romanticize it. Is there an equivalent in the context of Paraguay where it's not a denigration of the street vendors, but more like a celebration of their entrepreneurial spirit? Because that's also a really interesting move that neoliberals have done as far as sort of upholding this, with more of the workforce becoming informal, suddenly we're celebrating that, right, as like wily in entrepreneurship. So is that happening at all? I had to read about Horacio Cortez. I didn't know about him formerly. It's just fascinating. This is the former Paraguayan president that Jen talks about, super notorious. So apparently he gotten very wealthy on illicit cigarette trade, money laundering, and everything. What are his transnational links? I mean, this is more of an empirical question, but what's his story? I mean, in the sense of, does he have links with transnational, cigarette corporations? Like Philip Morris has also been really guilty of kickstarting the illicit cigarette trade, like back in the day. So I feel like there's a story there that maybe it exceeds the book, but I was also really interested in that character. And finally, actually I have two more questions. Let me quickly say that. So the second to last question is, from an urban theory perspective, what does the analytic of outlaw urbanism bring to the table that's different from informal urbanism, or even terms like elite illegalities, right? What do you think that we should pay attention to the outlaw ads in particular, if you were to, and I know that especially has to do with trade and contraband, but is there something that outlaw brings to the conversation that something like informality doesn't? doesn't do fully. And finally, you talk about the political agency of street vendors, and you have this really great few paragraphs about how we can't theorize it as a resistance, but there are these insurgent repertoires within what they do, the claims they make on the city, right, that have this social justice valence to it, which I thought was very well done. What about the Sacaleros? Like, what is their political agency? Those who come from Brazil and try to take advantage of the arbitrage price difference between 25-cent cigarettes sold on the streets of Ciudad del Este and $7 cigarettes, or the equivalent of, sold in Brazil. Like, what is their agency here? I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. So I'll end there and say thank you very, very much again for writing this absolutely brilliant and beautifully written book. And I hope all of you and more go and read the book. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Melanie. Teo, why don't you jump in and then I'll respond quickly to both of you.
Sounds good. Those were great comments, and some of which really resonate with things that that I'm going to say. And of course, first of all, thank you for inviting me and for the invitation to read this book. I think it's a great book. It was genuinely, honestly, like a pleasure to read. So congratulations, Jen, for this accomplishment. It's also great to join these two colleagues who I also admire and respect and have learned so much from. And like Malini, I was also, floored by the writing. I know Jen from since our days at Berkeley, and I feel like you think you know a person, and then you read, what they've written, and is just so impressed and admire that as well. Given the venue, I also just want to start off by saying how nice it was to read something about Paraguay. It's a country, that has always fascinated me. And yet I feel like, and maybe, partly this is my own ignorance, but I feel like it's a place that is written about so little. It's so like poorly understood and ends up falling into this like sensationalism or exceptionalism, as you call it, that is really not productive for understanding it, and on its own terms as well. And then the research itself, and as Malini pointed out, the ethical, self-reflexive care and compassion that clearly went into this research is also really commendable. And when you read a book like this, especially when it's so flawlessly written, it's so easy to forget that all the work that goes into constructing these stories, working in these spaces is so hard, and it's so fraught that it's easy for us to forget like all that labor that it really kind of takes. So for me, this is a story about the way globalized capital sort of takes urban illegality and turns it into an open terrain of class conflict. And I see the book as essentially a story about class. Because what she shows us in such rich and compelling, ethnographic detail is a city that literally develops out of this conflict between macro and micro transgressions of the law. And macro and micro, I think that's my term. She doesn't use that, I think. The macro transgressions are those from, political leaders, foreign investors, real estate magnates, and other elites. And the product of these shady macro transgressions are like the mall that we saw in the presentation. And these micro transgressors are what she calls, with a nod to Gramsci, I think, the merchant bloc. On the other side, you have these like wonderfully scrappy street vendors. And when I say vendors, I'm also thinking about some of the other characters and actors in the book, like the Sacoleiros or other, traders. And they're over there, the vendors are over there literally vying for a space of their own. They're in the business, however, of micro transgressions, and their moral economy, in which it's a moral economy in which the bending and breaking of rules is how they manage to capture like a tiny fraction of the value that's like coursing through the city on like a fire hose. And Ciudad del Este, which comes out of these class conflicts, is not just, as geographers like to say, not only the setting, but also the product of these struggles. That story that I just described could have very easily fallen into a kind of reductive narrative of David versus Goliath, mapped onto these macro versus micro transgressions. But no, the book presents these subaltern actors as neither, powerless pawns nor heroic, subaltern resistance of hegemonic. No, it's much more complicated than that. And these sort of just like make do, like they're with the challenges that are put before them. And here's where I think the ethnography really, really shines, because Jen doesn't shy away from the profound political ambiguity that characterizes these vendors' moral economy. This is not like Weapons of the Week of Paraguay. It's much more than that, much more nuanced. They're still subject to these much more powerful forces and people. The struggle is real, but ultimately, even their minor victories, and I would argue, or arguably, I guess, they are minor victories. The vendors end up reproducing their own marginalization in so many ways, and even their dispossession. So hence her concept of accumulation by transgression, which she calls the core logic of outlaw capital. And I guess because of this, this is one reason I'm still skeptical, or at least more than maybe Jen is, about the insurgent politics of the vendors. And I guess this kind of goes on Malini's point at the end. Like, Jen's totally measured about the political possibilities and potential of this politics, but it still seems a bit like the word in Spanish is rebuscado, which means like researched for, looking for. Yeah, like it's stretched, maybe overstated. That's a better way to put it. Like, I feel there's like this, you really want to like stretch, find the like silver lining of political not resistance, but a political silver lining. I'm wondering about that. And related, I don't know if I'm reading too much here, but I feel like I detected from your part, Jen, like a deep ambivalence about their politics. And I think that ambivalence actually comes out in the ethnography in really beautiful and compassionate ways, in a way in which insurgent to me lacks that same sense of uncertainty, tentativeness, and kind of open-endedness. It's much more like I don't know, there's something stronger about it that seems inconsistent with the other more open-ended way that you describe their politics. That ambivalence is not surprising to me, because basically what we're talking about is the law. And part of the question here is whether the law and or law breaking can be steered towards social justice in the city. And one of the people that I go to when thinking about class politics and the law or illegality is E.P. Thompson. And I'm thinking of his work like on Whigs and Hunters or the moral economy of the crowd, because one of his points there is a critique, and it was a critique against Marxists who had relinquished analysis of the law and legality because they dismissed it as some sort of bourgeois conceit or construction pretense. And Thompson was telling us that legality is actually a crucial terrain of class struggle that can't sort of left to, So as an account of this struggle between micro and macro transgressions, or she calls them at one point, the illegalities of the street versus the illegalities of elites, This book feels very much in that Thompsonian tradition, I guess you would say. That's really what I feel is like at the crux of the ethnography, and that's another thing that the book does incredibly well. Its analysis never loses sight of the structural forces, but also doesn't lose sight of people's like real lives and lived experience. And holding those two things at the same time is really, really hard to do, and it's done so well here. So a couple more things to say, but at the end of it, I felt a real ambivalence towards the vendors' politics. So to riff on Thompson again, like, could we call this the making of the Paraguayan middle class, or like the aspiring middle class? Are the vendors now like the window shoppers at the malls that stand on the ground that they once claimed? Because again, I think even their opposition or their strategies somehow always end up back into like the functional cogs and wheels of outlaw capitalism. They get sort of swallowed up by the city despite their best efforts against it. So at the end of it, there's this sort of like resigned acquiescence that, don't get me wrong, to be clear, I'm not like critiquing or judging their choices. I just want to better understand how you see this as counter-hegemonic to neoliberalism. So it's not a critique, it's a question. Yeah, I'll end there, but again, just congratulate you, Jen, on this huge, awesome, really fun to read book. And yeah, thanks again for letting me join you all to think about it together. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for those generous comments. I'll just say a few words. I probably won't be able to answer all the questions, so we can have time for a conversation and questions from others. But I will, yeah, I'll start with Malini's question about the horizon of right-wing anti-corruption politics. Why is it so powerful and so successful? And I think, I think this very, very well. I think it's that anti-corruption really taps into a deep, effective, emotional sense that things aren't fair, and that that there is this deep inequality. And so, but then it gets sort of connected to common sense social hierarchies about who's taking what people should have, et cetera, which is oftentimes racialized. And I think what is really challenging about like the anti-corruption movement is essentially the political subject of anti-corruption politics is the outraged individual rather than sort of the political collective. And I think that's what makes it so challenging. And I think that in terms of this question about, to kind of tie together some questions of both Malini and Teo's about the politics from below or the politics of street vendors. Street vendors do, there was a term that a friend used to describe a street vendor setup called bohenda, which means, it's a Guarani term that means to claim a space, to make a space for something, but also to look for solutions. And it has that sense of like creating relationships, keeping open the field of possibilities, so that things might shift in the future and this relationship will pan out. So there is like that sort of certainly that ethos in politics of keeping things open, maintaining relationships to power brokers, that is so important. And I think is a little bit about what you're getting at, Malini, of the term that I forget of in India. And in terms of to get to Teo's question about sort of the politics of this, I think that in a sense that it is a really challenging space in which it's a challenging space, and it's also a challenging moment beyond this particular space to have to sort of put forward hopeful narratives of positive change. And I think the impulse behind paying attention to what I was thinking about as sort of the embers was two things. Like, one, I think there are sort of alternate ways of thinking and doing and being that can be present, that we need to train ourselves for. So part of that was that impulse of like, okay, can I pay attention to the the things that have the most potential, and that was kind of an ethical commitment going into it, that the more insurgent politics were not sort of the most powerful dynamic shaping urban space and urban futures, but it felt like a really important thing to pay attention to. And I do think where there is some potential isn't necessarily in like the material politics, but it is in the urban epistemology, which does put forward a vision of the city that is oriented towards need and use. So thinking of urban space as how it can meet people's needs rather than how, so it's sort of an exchange value, use value thing that, well, it was an important part of the story. And one of the vendors I talk about described the city as an olla popular, or a collective soup pot. And so that sort of vision, even if it is unlikely to materialize in sort of radical politics in Ciudad del Este, I think it can be inspiring, and was sort of one of the reasons that I sort of took that approach. And I do think this is a story about class struggle, and claiming the terrain of the law as a site of that struggle, and claiming sort of legality and extra legality, and the ways that folks would sort of claim their, ordinary vendors would claim their rule breaking as ethical, in direct, explicit comparison. Ethical because it meets livelihood needs, instead of unethical because it lines already rich people's pockets. And maybe the last thing I'll say before we open up to questions, is just this question of maybe what contraband urbanism or outlaw capital might give us that we don't get from informality. And I think it is precisely this attention to class conflict and inequality. And what one of the impulses of the book was to kind of look at street illegalities and elite illegalities. And I think that's something that the field of informality hasn't been historically very good at. It tends to turn its gaze toward the practices of the poor and marginalized. So we just have a few minutes. Maybe we have some questions from the audience. Yeah, Joseph.
Thank you. Your presentation and your book makes me think back of my time in Paraguay and how I was floored by the times I was there in 97, 99. And, my own recent publication, I look at the way that rural campesinos overcome and challenge and engage and organize in terms of getting access to potable water. And me being a Peace Corps volunteer, much like yourself, Jennifer, and of course, I spent time in Ciudad del Este, and I spent 10 years basically as a Peace Corps volunteer, then doing research in and out of Paraguay. But I compare it to my own experience of growing up, in segregated South Texas, and being from Laredo, Texas, and my grandfather was a contrabandista. And there's some interesting historical work by George Diaz called Contrabandista Culture. But my question is, and necessarily what you didn't talk about, but somewhat, is how did your Peace Corps experience influence this research and your own background? Because a lot of what I publish and I write is heavily influenced by my own work and publications on voting rights in South Texas. Great,
thank you. Maybe we could collect if there's another question, and then I can answer 2 or 3 together. Yeah, Patrick.
Thank you. My own is not a question, but a comment. I think this is the second time I'm listening to your presentation on this book. And it looks like I'm just thinking about the 2 bigger cities in Ghana. And what you wrote about is what there. Like the micro and the macro transgression, starting from the politicians and state leaders who, flout the marginalized in a lot of, instances, which are considered as illegality. So it's great. I wish some of this research can be conducted in my country as well, so that I really know what is going on. So all that I'm saying is congratulations, you did a good job. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Raul, do you want to jump in, and then I'll offer a round of responses?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Raul Duarte. I'm a Paraguayan PhD student, but I am currently back in Paraguay doing fieldwork actually on Paraguayan customs, so this is very interesting. I haven't gotten to read the book yet, but I've read the short article on Antipode, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. And I was wondering if you had any more research also just related to customs beyond like the snapshots that I got to read, because I think it is fascinating, and I am kind of doing some research that delves into that other side as well of undervaluation of how like customs inspectors might collude with customs brokers. And so it's really fascinating to hear the other side of like smaller scale smuggling as well. But I was wondering if you had any work related to like the quote unquote more formal customs work.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so just to respond to the first question about my prior experience. Yeah, I returned to Paraguay and in some ways to kind of make sense of my Peace Corps experience. In the introduction, I reflect that, one thing I did as a Peace Corps volunteer was actually write a short piece for an in-house journal, I was actually called a case against the Peace Corps because I had some questions about sort of that international development model that sends young, enthusiastic Americans, oftentimes white Americans around the world, and sort of suggests that this is going to be the solution to poverty, which is not actually what it is. But it's like I learned Guarani when I was living in this little rural town. I actually had connections to Ciudad del Este that I wasn't even aware of at the time, because Ciudad del Este is sort of present across the country because it's such an economic powerhouse. And then there's certainly other maybe I'll just leave it at that. So returning to Paraguay felt important, and I was able to connect to street vendors through the networks that I had as a Peace Corps volunteer. I commend you for studying customs, like the Paraguayan customs. That's going to be a tricky endeavor. They're not super keen on being studied, and have considerable capacity to kind of keep things as a black box. I mean, I think what's important to pay attention to is just sort of there's sort of the open secrets. Like everybody knows about La Tablita, right? Which is sort of this a local term for the technology of undervaluation, which kind of describes the split between these different actors. And there's really specialized functions, right? Like fixers is kind of a role, like a despachante is like somebody who makes it all happen. And so that's like that is a particular economic function, and it's sort of there's unions to support them. There's actually a union for small scale smugglers also. So like the extent to which the extra legal is sort of institutionalized, I think is really fascinating. And the way that it is an open secret, and then people sort of know how it works. But yeah, happy to chat more with you, and if you want to go into more detail.
Certainly,
well,
I can send an email.
Yeah, great. Theo.
No, what you were just describing really made me think about all this work that's been coming out about infrastructure and logistics, and the way, that literature really focuses on these macro projects and sort of like on almost like a global scale analysis. And I feel like your book is also really speaks to that, and sort of the like micro logistics through which that are also infrastructure that don't look like traditional infrastructure. I wonder if that's like a future direction where this could go, but just a comment.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, I think we're at time, so we'll wrap up. Thank you so much to Malini and Theo and Sam and the Latin American and Iberian Institute, and all of you for coming today to listen to this talk.